Hello everyone and welcome back to the School of Taste. Welcome if this is your first time attending one of my live webinars, and especially welcome if you are watching on recording. This is our third session in this series of 6 webinars about how to taste wine with a view to assessing a wine structure, and the final of 3 webinars discussing in particular acid structure in white wines. Now, as ever, if you are watching this live, please use the questions function for your comments and your questions during the course of the webinar. And without any further announcement, let's move straight to the first slide. So this slide, the content of this slide will be familiar to anyone who's been here for the last couple of weeks. This is simply a reminder to us about what we're looking for when we assess acid structure. So, of course, we start with the level of the acidity in the wine, and then we describe the type of acidity, i.e. what sensation or texture does that acidity give in the mouth. And then finally, we come to my more crazy idea about the idea that different varieties have got different acid shapes. And what that really means is that during the time the wine spends on your palate, during that time, there might be moments when you feel the acidity more than other moments. So you might feel the acidity particularly at the beginning, or particularly at the end, or maybe in the middle, or maybe it just stays consistent throughout. So one of the really interesting ways of distinguishing between different varieties, according to my approach, is that each one has got a very slightly different shape of acidity. So when you combine those 3, the level of acidity, the type of the acidity, and the shape of the acidity, you really narrow down your options for what a variety is likely to be. And again, my overall argument is that whatever you do to the wine in terms of the climate where you grow it, whether or not you do malolactic fermentation, whether you age the wine in oak, whether you make the wine sparkling or sweet, my argument is always that varieties retain the same acid structure, whatever treatment you put them through. And so rather than being perhaps swayed sometimes by different flavor or aroma profiles, then acid structure may be a more reliable and consistent way of assessing varieties. That's the argument. So let's see whether we can taste and whether the tasting backs that up. So we're going to taste 3 varieties: Riesling, Albariño, and Grüner Veltliner today. Let's start with Riesling. So please go ahead, pour your Riesling if you're tasting along. And then if you're watching live, then please tell me where your Riesling comes from. The great thing about this approach, again, is that, I mean, when I was giving out suggestions to you guys about where to get your Riesling from, then I was able to list, you know, a dozen different possible regions, 3, 4, 5 different countries where you could get a Riesling that would be suitable for this purpose. Because again, I don't think the climate matters too much. Just something which is a typical example of variety. And I do think that Riesling is one of those varieties that grow in all sorts of different places around the world, will always be recognizably Riesling, even before you get to acid structure. But the acid structure, nonetheless, of Riesling is very interesting and I hope worth studying. Okay, so let's see what you guys have got today. Luciana's got one from Washington State, good. Fred is in Australia, in Clare Valley. Stanislavs is in the Pfalz region of Germany. So already 3 wines, 3 different countries, which I love, and 3 different continents. Nancy is in the Saar region of Germany. Nisha in the Rhine-Hessen. Kathleen and Ruma both from Alsace, along with Maria. So very different styles, but we can talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then while you are pouring your wine, you can take the first sniff of your wine, the first taste of it. Let's just talk about flavors and aromas that you guys are getting. Again, we do this because we want to focus our minds on flavors and aromas now, so then we can move on away from that and focus on acid structure in a minute. But you have to, your mind won't let you stop thinking about flavor for at least a little bit. So Please tell me what aromas and flavors you're getting from your different expressions. Quite a few people have Alsace, which is great. Shengali's got Nar. I love Nar. Naha is perhaps not such a well-known region in Germany as it should be. Perhaps most famous for being the home of the great Dönhoff estate, but not by any means a region as big as the Mosel. So perhaps for that reason, not so well known, but wonderful wines from there. Okay, so Maria from Alsace is saying she's getting some petrol and slaty notes. Shengli, who has got the Naha example, has in fact got a Dönhoff, just as I was talking about. I do think that Dönhoff is one of the great producers, not just in the Naha Valley, but in Germany, period. I was lucky to visit last year, and we had a wonderful time. So Corey is getting some apricot ginger. Remind me, Corey, is that Alsace? Fred is getting lemons, melon, tropical fruit. Very good. I mean, the great thing about Riesling, according to when it's grown in different climates, is that it can take on such a wide variety of aroma and flavor profiles. It can be, if you come from the coolest regions in the Mosel, it can be quite subtle, but then you get just over the border in France, these huge emphatic examples with these amazing petrol, smoky aromatics, very, very different. Kathleen is saying ripe peach and minerals. Alice, pear, citrus, spice, good. Corey's apricot and ginger comes from the Rhine-Hessen, so it sounds like quite a ripe example, which is no surprise from the Rhine-Hessen, a sunny region. Stanislav's white orchard fruits. Alice is saying that her Eden Valley example from Australia has got the classic notes of lime and kerosene, very typical of many Australian examples. Shengli from the Naha in Germany, apricot honey, petrol, lemon curd, very good. Nisha from the Rhine-Hessen, rocky minerals, good. Apricot, white peach. Yeah, I do think there's quite Riesling in many regions can be quite a stone fruit variety. Lots of peaches and apricots and things like that. Melons, lemons, peaches for Luciana. Good. Okay, so that's aromas and flavors. Now let's just think a little bit about acid structure. First of all, please tell me the level of acidity in your Riesling. Again, you know, what I always talk about with levels is trying to find a benchmark wine. So maybe, you know, Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire or from New Zealand might be an example of a wine with high acidity. Maybe that's something that you can benchmark your Riesling against to see what level of acidity you're at. Maria's got very high acidity. Vidya has got in her Grand Cru Riesling from Alsace. Sounds great, Vidya. Stanislav has got high pronounced acidity. Luciana's got medium plus. Kathleen's got high. And high for Joy as well. Very high for Fred. Fleur is saying high for the Mosel, racy. Corey is saying searingly high for Rhine-Hessen. Very good. High for Alsace. Lynn is saying high for Rhine-Hessen, Auslese. Good. So it does seem that, you know, we have a whole variety of regions represented across 3 continents: Australia, North America, and Europe. And almost all the examples have got high acidity, or even more than that, very high. So, you know, that's the first thing I always make the point of saying to people. People often say to me, oh, well, you know, you can just smell a Riesling and know it's a Riesling and just by the aromas. And I'm not so sure about that for the very reason that I was just talking about, that it can take on such a wide spectrum of flavors, from the lime of Australia to the peaches, ripeness of Germany, and even more intensity from, say, Alsace. but I do think that one thing that never changes with Riesling is the high acidity. If you're growing Riesling and your end result doesn't have high acidity, then maybe that's not the best variety for where you're at. So I do think that high acidity is an absolute hallmark of Riesling, whether or not it's sweet or dry. Okay, so let's talk about that high acidity. Is there a certain adjective, a certain term that you can use that kind of captures the essence of how that acidity feels in your mouth? These are just some suggestions here on the slide, but you don't have to use those if you can find something better. The sensation or the texture, you know, we often think about acidity being fresh or mouth-watering. Sure, that's what acidity always does, but can we be a bit more descriptive than that and find it something which is maybe unique or special about Riesling acidity? So we've got a few more German examples. People are just commenting about how high the acidity levels are in the German wines, and for sure. I mean, if you look at where the German wine regions are on a map of Europe, you realize just how far north they are, and the relatively cool climate of northern Europe certainly is a great region, a great place for preserving high levels of acidity. Anisha is saying the type of acidity could be called lifting. Okay, lifting, I like that, good. Louise in Alsace is saying zesty, good, very nice. Alice in Alsace is saying electric. So zesty and electric, both from Alsace, I think are quite similar to each other. Both of them contain this sense of energy or vibrancy, which I quite like. But Alice also notes she's got two examples, but her Eden Valley, Australia example has got more firm acidity. Good. So maybe a bit more steady rather than the electric energy of the Alsace. Shengli is saying that the acidity in the Naha example is well integrated into the fruit. We'll talk about that in a minute, but if you have not been to maybe the first session, I think it was, we were talking about the sensation. There are some varieties where the fruit seems to be here and the acidity seems to be over here. The point that Shengli is making is that the fruit and the acidity seem to be quite well knit together. Good. Kathleen is also another vote for zesty. Luciana is saying electric or vibrant. Vidya, zesty. Fred is saying bouncing from the floor to the ceiling of the palate. Or vertical, like a spike, good. Fleur is saying often Mosel has quite crystalline acidity, which means very precise and taut. Yeah, I completely agree with you. So let's talk about region by region on the next slide, but I agree, Fleur, very much. Ruma is saying zippy or zesty. Another vote for zesty. Lynn is saying in the Rheinhessen it's inseparable from the fruit, so well integrated, but almost soft around the edges. Sharp but soft. Maybe it's the fruit that's soft and the acidity that's sharp, Lynn. She's saying oval shaped, long and elliptical on the tongue. Okay, good, that's a nice description. Stanislavs is saying piercing and vertical. Nisha is saying although the acidity could be integrated, the fruit is on one wavelength and the acidity on another. And I think that may be the point that Lynn was also making, that the fruit in Riesling doesn't have to be as firm, to use one adjective that someone just threw out there, but as the acidity is. The acidity can have that one texture, but often the fruit can be a bit softer. And that effect is enhanced if there is residual sugar in your example. Of course, sugar softens anything. Louise is saying that the acidity begins strong, disappears, and then comes back strong again, similar to what Vidya is saying. Kathleen is saying it's vertical. Okay, good. Some great responses there. So let's see what I came up with, because I can't even remember myself. Okay, here we go. So we discussed the level of the acidity being high. I don't think that's too controversial. The type of acidity. I mean, I repeat what I always say at this point, which is that you have to find the adjective which is meaningful to you, and I totally understand zesty and electrical and all that. But to me, what I love about Riesling acidity is this, the steeliness of it, as if it's sort of reflecting back the light. It kind of glints or shimmers in the light, which is why I call it shiny. And I'll come back to that in just a sec and explain more what I mean by that. But this to me is very strongly connected, I think, with the shape of the acidity. So to me, Riesling is the quintessential vertical acid structure white variety. What does that mean? If you look under other terms down here, this may help you to understand what I mean by vertical. So vertical means that the acidity is like a pole or a bar, which is straight down through the heart of the wine. So you can see under other terms I've written, it pins down the wine, one way of explaining this is that Riesling is quite a static wine. It will just sit on your palate quite happily and not really have any mind to be anywhere else. It will just hang out there quite happily. Of course, anyone who's been listening attentively will know that I'm implicitly comparing this to Chardonnay or to a couple of other varieties that we looked at last week, which have got what I call horizontal acid structures. Now, wines with horizontal acid structures, what that means is that the acidity is always on a journey somewhere, and it's always letting you know it's on the road to somewhere. It always has a destination in mind. In the case of Chardonnay, you think about a Blanc de Blanc Champagne or a Chablis, cool climate expressions of Chardonnay. That high acidity just kind of races through the middle of the wine, through the heart of the wine. And that's what I mean about wine having a sense of direction or purpose. To me, that is horizontal, because it's like on a road, it's going along somewhere. So those wines, those horizontal or linear acid profiles in those varieties contrast very vividly here with Riesling, which I think, as I was saying, just kind of sits here on the palate. And one of the reasons why it sits here isn't just because you know, the fruit can be quite kind of rich and plump and sit there on the mid palate on the tongue quite happily, especially again if there's any residual sugar in the wine, but more because the acidity, the vertical nature of this acidity seems to pin the fruit down in place. So it can't move, it's almost been pinned down. So this is why I have this silly comparison with like the anchor or of a ship, you know, or like the chain of the anchor. It holds, the anchor pulls the chain taut and keeps everything in place. You know, people, I didn't come up with these ones. These are more common. I think people often talk about the backbone of Riesling being the acidity, the backbone or the spine of the wine. Again, capturing this sense of verticality. And that's also what I'm trying to get at in these silly illustrations I have here, on this slide. So one of them is the kind of maypole, and then this Mexican dance that someone told me about in the slide below. What I'm trying to capture in both of these is the sense of the pole in the middle being the stable element of the wine, whereas the dancers around the edge of it can be the fruit or the sugar or the texture or the other elements of the wine. They can all move around, but the acidity is what's holding everything in place. Okay, so I've spoken for long enough, so I just want to see your comments on all this. Just give me 1 sec to pull these up here. Okay. Louise, if you think this acidity feels like a roller coaster, then just please wait for 45 minutes. Nisha is saying that Riesling and Chenin have got a similar acid structure. Well, Chenin, as we talked about in the first session, has got an acid structure which starts quite soft. You don't really perceive the acidity very much. But then it gets louder and louder during the course of the wine. That's why I call it the crescendo acid structure. So it can't really be compared to Riesling, because Riesling is just like Chardonnay in the sense that the level of acidity, the perception of how much acidity there is in the wine that we have, doesn't change. It's always high. You know that from the first moment the Riesling hits your palate until after you swallow it. So the level stays the same, which is contrast with the Chenin, where it increases during the course of the wine. And then I do think that Chenin, perhaps it's not quite as linear as Chardonnay, but it does still have this feature where it does seem to have some sense of energy or direction in it, simply because at the end of Chenin, you have to spit because the acidity is so high. So really, it's on the journey to that point where you have to spit or you have to swallow the wine. Whereas Riesling, you can just hold the wine in your palate for as long as you want, really, albeit the acidity is going to make your mouth water a lot because it's so high. So I think it's a bit of a horizontal versus vertical sensation between Chenin Blanc and Riesling, for sure. But I think more to the point, the level of acidity is much more consistent in Riesling. Okay. Yeah, I mean, Corey's just making a great point, which I made really a little earlier, which is that you know, Riesling is such a fantastic example for people like me to study, people who are interested in the structure of wine, simply because acidity dominates Riesling. It doesn't. It's not just there as a sort of bit part or a supporting actor. Acidity is such is probably the absolutely key feature of Riesling. And so a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, I can identify Riesling because of the sugar. Well, in some examples have got sugar, but even in Germany, they're a minority. Forget about Alsace or Austria or Australia, where they're almost always dry. So I don't think relying on sweetness is a good idea. I don't think relying on flavors like we were talking about at the beginning, because Riesling can take on such a broad spectrum of flavors. But I do think that this vertical acidity that pins down the fruit and the rest of the wine, I think that's really the elemental character of Riesling. Vitali, will the structure characters work with sparkling? Yes, exactly. As I was saying at the top, whatever winemaking you put this through, any of these varieties through, then the acid structure should always remain consistent. There may be other features, like in the example of sparkling, the bubbles, which may impede how easy it is to perceive the acid structure, or you might have to fight through the bubbles or the oak or the malolactic notes or lees notes. You might have to fight through all that stuff to get to the acid structure, to really taste the acid structure. But if my theory is right, then the acid structure will remain consistent according to each variety and its own acid structure. Okay, so a little bit about regions for Riesling. Germany, you know, Germany is the land of Riesling. There are 13 wine-producing regions in Germany. I think all of them, maybe bar one, the R in the north there, which is Pinot Noir land. Maybe all bar the R make Riesling. So many different examples. Again, remember what I said about Germany being so far north, very sensitive to climate. So even small differences, the difference from the Mosel, just go a little bit south to the Nahe, will make a difference in terms of the taste profile. Slightly warmer, slightly fuller bodied from the Nahe. Again, on the south-facing slopes of the Rheingau, they're powerful wines. Likewise in the Rheinhessen often. And this is even before we get down further south to Pfalz and especially to Baden, which is at the same level as Alsace. So I don't want to go into that too much. I do have a mind soon to do a webinar just on German Riesling by region, because I love German Riesling and I think it'd be super fascinating to do that. So watch this space. Other countries, Alsace, you guys who've got Alsace know all about the if you were here for Pinot Gris last week, Alsace from Riesling from Alsace, again, huge body, often medium to full-bodied wine, more texture, slightly bitter finish, often slightly higher alcohol in the Grand Cru examples at least. a very emphatic wine in every way. Austria, tangy, vibrant, spicy, peppery, full of energy Austrian examples. Australia, the combination of this kind of limey fruit and petrol notes are very, very consistent, but often quite bone dry, very, very dry wines from Australia. And then I think Finger Lakes or Washington State, basically slightly softer, slightly fruitier styles of Riesling, usually with a little bit of residual sugar. Of course, there is a lot more Riesling out there than all that, but just that's the way I think about those major Riesling producing countries and regions. Luciana saying, can we do the acidity comparison with Sect, Riesling Sparkling, Cava from Spain, Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir? Yeah, exactly. Be my guest, Luciana. Exactly. We can do it, and that's why there's such a, for instance, a really good way to do it is by looking at Blanc de Blanc Champagne and a Blanc de Noir Champagne. Huge differences. Yeah, of course, there's a lot more going on in those wines, so you can get a bit distracted. But the acid structure is very noticeably different. And in those examples as well, it's a little bit tricky because you're comparing Chardonnay in Blanc de Blanc Champagne, which is all about acid structure and the linearity of that acid structure, with the fruitiness of Pinot Noir and the slight tannin structure you get from the use of red grapes. So it's not quite like with like, but in a way that makes those differences stand out all the more. So we can definitely do that. Of course, you have to be here next week and for the following weeks to understand about tannin structure. But no, I don't think that the CO2 changes the acid structure. Okay, any more questions about Riesling? Does everyone understand the concept of a vertical acid structure? This kind of creating this sense of a wine being pinned down in place so it doesn't move, it's kind of static, and the other elements of the wine or are kind of the body of the wine is built around that backbone, that spine of acidity. I remember earlier on in this course, people were asking about what's the difference between horizontal and vertical, where you talk about Chardonnay. And I really wanted everyone just to wait to taste the Riesling, because that's, I think, when you really get it. And I hope you guys do, but please tell me if you don't, and I will try and clarify further. Okay, so why don't we move on to our second wine, which is Albariño. So while you're pouring the Albariño, let me move this slide back here just so we can see our categories again when we're tasting the Albariño. I assume that most of you have got examples from Spain, of course, probably from Rías Baixas. If you have got an Albariño from anywhere else, then please let me know, because I'm always fascinated by these unusual regions for these important grape varieties. I did have that a very nice example from Uruguay quite recently. It was delicious and very varietally typical. That was very nice. Bodegas Garçon. But yeah, really Albariño, I don't think people have yet to find great growing locations for the variety outside of northwest Spain. Okay, so tell me, let's do aromas and flavors first, as usual. Tell me what you're getting here on the nose and on the palate of your Albariño. Again, I definitely think that Albariño is a good variety to keep on your palate for 4 to 5 seconds, because there's a lot going on in Albariño. A lot of flavor, a lot of acid, and a lot of other stuff that we're going to talk about. So just make sure to keep it up there long enough to try and extract everything that is going on there. Okay, so Maria is saying briny, salty, good. I love that, and that sounds just about right to me. Louise is saying bubblegum. What kind of bubblegum? Louise, a particular flavor. And Corey is also noting salinity. Very good. Kathleen is saying that she finds honeysuckle, lemon, lime, saline notes, peach, and a creamy texture. Good, that sounds very true to type. I love the honeysuckle note as well, which captures this slight florality, which I think is very, very true to the variety. Good. Fleur is saying salted almonds, good. Peaches and lots of texture. Yeah, good texture. Fantastic. Let's talk about that in a minute. Nisha has got orange citrus and lime. Yeah, the citrus one is interesting, isn't it? I do think it can be very helpful to qualify citrus more precisely than just saying citrus, because you have, I mean, orange is a long way away from a lime, for instance, and a lemon is probably more subtle than both, but big differences even within that family. Fred is getting white flower, green apple, and saltiness. So Shengli is also riffing off the theme of citrus with tangerine. Good. So we have some orange and we have some tangerine. Stanislavs is also mentioning the saline aromas, and his citrus is lime on the palate. Good. Kathleen, green olives. Good. I like that. Again, perhaps capturing the sense of saltiness to the wine, which Shengli is also mentioning. And for Vidya, zesty and lemon, honeysuckle. Good, another honeysuckle, excellent. White peaches and nectarines, so kind of stone fruits, but perhaps white stone fruits. I like that. Okay, so why don't we move on to the level of acidity? How would you characterize the level of acidity, bearing in mind that in the Riesling, you probably just had a high, or even in some examples, very high levels of acidity. Is this the same, or is it slightly less? Okay, Kathleen is saying high. Yeah, the green olive note is fun, isn't it? Because it captures something about the savoriness and the saltiness. And perhaps also, we can talk about this in a minute, about texture as well. Okay, high levels of acidity for Maria. Kathleen is saying not quite as high as the Riesling. Louise, high and bracing. Fred is saying high but less than the Riesling. Yeah, I feel like that's quite a sensible observation. Fleur is saying high also. Okay, good. So it seems like there's a general consensus around high. Maybe not quite the level of Riesling, but still, you could still characterize it as high. Good. Okay, now what do you guys think about the type of the acidity? What's the word you're going to use that best captures the sensation of the acidity when the wine is on your mouth? Kathleen is going for electric yet firm. Good. Okay, electric yet firm. Maybe like a high tension electricity line on one of those pylons. It's kind of stretched taut. Kathleen, what do you think? Electric yet firm. Vidya is saying zesty, spiky. Fleur is saying tangy. I do think there is a family resemblance between zesty and tangy for sure. Corey is saying firm, good. Alice is saying sherbety, which I assume means some kind of zesty life there as well, Alice. Vidya says bracing, good. Yeah, a nice range of adjectives. Good work, guys. And then finally, again, always the most difficult category to pin down. And if you find it difficult, then that is totally normal. So don't sweat it. But the shape of the acidity, this is where we think about whether there's peaks and troughs. And also perhaps think about physically in your mouth, are there places where you feel that acidity more than elsewhere? At the front of your mouth, on the gums, or on the roof, or the floor, or on the finish? Does the acidity physically hit your mouth? You feel it more in a particular place than elsewhere. So the shape and where in the mouth you feel that acidity. Let's talk about that now. Okay, so Kathleen is saying she feels it at the front of the mouth, rising, and then falling, but stronger at the beginning. Okay, good. Stanislav's, I think, is on the same page as Kathleen by saying front of the mouth, rising. Stanislav says the opposite to the crescendo of Chenin Blanc that we were just talking about. It starts on the front and then sort of slackens, lessens with time. Okay, good. Louise mentioning that it feels strong in the front on the upper gums. Good. Fred is saying he feels it especially from the top to the bottom of the mouth, floor to ceiling. Okay, good. Corey is mentioning that while the acidity is quite high, it doesn't dominate like perhaps the acidity does in Riesling that I was going on about. But it's more, but he says, like Riesling, it is nonetheless quite static. Okay, good. Okay, any other final thoughts about the shape of the acidity before I see what I came up with? Okay, let's see. That's Riesling. Here's Albariño. Okay. So I'm going with high. I agree with Fred. I think the acidity is high in Albariño. I think it's really a very typical component of Albariño, the high acidity, but perhaps not quite at the same almost extreme level as Riesling. The type of the acidity I'm going with zesty. Zesty, I think a few of you mentioned zesty in terms of having that kind of energy to the acidity. Limey, I guess, is trying to capture the sense of almost like something like a lime pith. That's the kind of sensation that we talked a lot about citrus in the descriptions. So I'm almost giving a flavor to the acidity when I say limey, but almost that texture as well. And we'll come back to powerful and chewy in just a second. The shape of the acidity, this is the one that I call wall to wall, and that's if you guys get the illustration of wall to wall in the bottom right of this slide. That's my illustration of wall to wall because it's wall to wall carpet, like in a home furnishings catalog. Wall to wall carpet. Wall-to-wall acidity in Albariño, what that means is that for me, when you first put the wine in your mouth, you get a massive wave of acidity that you have to kind of bust through. The first thing that you get is acidity in Albariño as soon as you put it on your mouth. And then it seems to subside quite quickly. But then on the finish, after you spat or swallowed, then the wall seems to come back. And again, you've got to kind of bust through that wall. So to me, if Riesling is like the steak, the vertical steak, then Albariño is more like two vertical walls, one at either end of the palate. One at the beginning when the wine first hits the palate, and one at the end, right when you've swallowed. So that's what I'm calling wall to wall. Now, people, I know I said in the book, if any of you've got the book, that I find Albariño quite square, and this is, I think, what Fred was mentioning, which is that you can also perceive the acidity on the roof and on the floor of your palate. So then you combine that with the wall to wall, right, on the floor and the ceiling, and then you get a square. But doing these kind of webinars and just trying to do these tastings with people, they say, oh, well, I don't really get so much the floor and the ceiling. I more get the beginning and the end, the wall to wall. So that's why I'm going to simplify it down to that. And I don't disagree with that. I prefer the beginning and the end, the wall to wall, to the square. But if you get the square, that's great. That's great too. Okay. So let's just come on to a couple of words that I didn't yet mention in the type of acidity, powerful. So what I want to do is contrast powerful with high. So the level of the acidity is high. That's what we've already agreed on. but the type of acidity is powerful. Now, we just dealt with another variety in Riesling with high acidity, right? But I don't think many of us would say that the acidity of Riesling is powerful in the sense of being kind of muscular. I think that that sensation is more specific to Albariño. So Riesling might have high acidity, but it doesn't create a very strong sense of architecture in the mouth. Like I said, you find the acidity through the middle of the fruit, and it gives a bit of structure to all that. But it is not kind of mouth coating in the kind of ways that we're talking about here. So what I'm arguing is that Albariño doesn't just have high acidity, it has powerful acidity in the sense of providing a powerful structure to the wine. Albariño, to my mind, is one of the more powerfully structured varieties out there. Another example of this syndrome we experienced in week 1 with Assyrtiko, and I mentioned Albariño in that context. That's another wine with a very powerful acid structure. It's got high acid, yes, but more to the point, powerful acid structure. And why, in the case of Albariño, do we feel this structure so strongly? Well, I think it's because of the last word I've written down there under type of acidity, which is chewy. And chewy, for me, refers to the first word under other terms, which is phenolic. Now, if you're there for session 1, we talked about this a little bit in the context of Assyrtiko, but again, as a reminder, phenolics or phenolic content in a white wine are the solids in a white wine that come from the grape skins, and they give the sensation when they remain in the wine of chewiness, that it's almost like a lip smacking chewiness that you have to kind of crunch your way through that. And so phenolics are not acidity. This is a very obvious but important point. The acidity, as you know, just the things that acidity does, it causes the mouth to water, it has a fresh sensation, all that. Phenolics are much more, because they're solids within the liquid, they give a much more strong sense of architecture. And so in this wine, we have the same sensations we had in the Assyrtiko, which we have a high level of acidity, but we also have quite a high level of phenolic content, of solid content in the wine, which means that you're building structure on structure. So when I talk about Albariño having a powerful structure, then yes, it's got a powerful acid structure, but it's also got a powerful phenolic structure. So when you combine those two, you've got one of the most structured white varieties out there. Now, if you guys are still struggling to figure out what this phenolic thing I'm talking about is, this sense of chewiness, Fred is saying like a grippiness, almost like tannins in red wine, that it kind of grips hold of the insides of your mouth. And under other terms, you can see I've written green in the sense of being almost giving the sensation of being slightly unripe, unripe and quite hard and rigid. So the rigid thing is me trying to capture the sense of architecture, again, caused by a combination of the high acidity and the powerful phenolic content in the Albariño. So put together the acidity and the phenolics, you have quite a powerfully structured wine. And that's why words like hard and rigid I've also included on there to try and capture this sense of a real architecture in the mouth in Albariño. And again, just compare it back to Riesling with high levels of acidity. Riesling can, in places like Alsace and other regions, depending on winemaking style, have phenolic content, but usually not at the level of an Albariño or an Assyrtiko. Let me just see what your questions are. Louise is saying that the wall-to-wall acidity, does it mean it's more like consistent? What I really mean is you feel it especially at the beginning and especially at the end. And it really seems to diminish in the middle. So not really consistent. It's almost like two poles, one here, and then there's a kind of gap in the middle. There's one wall and another wall. So I wouldn't really call that consistent because you don't feel it so much in the middle. Okay, Fred is saying good grip on the palate with the high phenolics and the saltiness. So the other aspect I believe that phenolics gives, the phenolic content, the chewiness gives, is a sense of attack or bite to the wine. We talked about this a little bit last week in the context of Italian white wines, which often are pressed quite firmly on the skins, and so they extract a little bit of phenolic content, which is felt on the finish of the wine. So sometimes Italian white wines can be, frankly, not that exciting at the beginning, but on the finish, they've got a nice bit of phenolic bite or attack. So another aspect that the phenolics can play isn't just structuring a wine, but it's also to give the wine a sense of attack. So you've got acidity, obviously, which gives freshness, brightness. You've got phenolics, which give attack or bite. And then the third thing in Albariño, which does that, just to layer it on, is the salinity. Now, this is super cool because salinity, again, is a sensation that you get in Muscadet and Albariño and Assyrtiko, some other lesser varieties in Galicia and other regions. But again, salinity is another aroma or flavor or texture or all of the above, which adds a sense of freshness or vibrancy to the wine. The chemistry behind all that is complicated and I don't really understand it. But what I do know is that in Albariño, you have then not one, just acidity, not two, acidity and phenolics, but three different sources of freshness in the wine: acidity, phenolics, salinity. And you have the same triptych in Assyrtiko. You combine those three and they give a very vibrant wine from what can be quite a warm climate. Obviously in Greece, here a lot cooler on the Atlantic coast, but nonetheless, a very fresh wine. And I just think that's one of the reasons why Albariño really is a fantastic variety, because it's got those things all going on at once. That to me is the very definition of complexity in a wine. Yeah, Maria's just commenting on the Alsace Riesling being phenolic. Absolutely. So like we talked about last week, Alsace, in addition to Italian whites, often finishes phenolic. And I do think perhaps of all the Rieslings, the different regions we were talking about previously, I do think that Alsace is probably the one that makes the most structured examples of Riesling. Not just because of that phenolic content, but also just because the wines are quite ripe. They've got quite a lot of fruit, but also I just wonder whether the skins might get a bit thicker in that warm climate as they hang on the vines there. Yeah, I do think the wines from Alsace are very structured. Yeah, and that's, you know, with the Grand Cru system, these are wines that can age 10, 20 years, and surely the phenolic content and the structure in those wines, the combination of phenolics and acidity helps in that aging process. And the other thing that phenolics can also do is they can diminish the risk of oxidation in the wine, further helping the wine stay fresh by preventing oxidation. Louise, which is making a very fair point, but she doesn't understand the image of the bedroom. So if any of you have been interior designers before you got into wine, then there's a phrase in interior design when people are picking out like carpets and sofas and stuff like that for rooms. They say, oh, well, do you want to have a wood floor or do you want to have a carpet on the floor? And someone says, oh, I want to have carpet. And they say, okay, you can have wall-to-wall carpet. So the image is of wall-to-wall carpet in a bedroom. And so this is my silly way of remembering wall-to-wall. Okay, that's all it is. Don't take it too seriously. Okay, any more questions about Albariño? I love Albariño. I think it's a fantastic variety. It was showcasing all the different potential sources of freshness in a white wine. Acidity, phenolics, salinity, super cool. Okay, so why don't we move on to the final wine, the Grüner Veltliner. So I assume that most of you guys got a Grüner from Austria. Well, I'm sure we'll be in different regions from Austria. But while you pour that, as you have a chance to pour that, then tell me the aromas and flavors you're getting in your Grüner Veltliner, and tell me which region you're in as well, just for my interest. Fred is asking, Albariño from Spain, does it have the same structure as Albariño from Portugal? Well, Fred, you asked this question 6 months ago, and I didn't have an answer for you, but you'll be pleased to hear that just in order to answer this question, I took a vacation to Portugal, and for a week, I spent my time tasting Albariño from Vinho Verde. I did find, you'll be pleased to hear that it has the same structure. And I mean, it was actually quite funny. I was sitting there in my holiday villa in the Algarve, drinking this wine, and I thought, well, this tastes extremely similar to Spanish Albariño to me. So I looked at the address on the back label of the wine of this Vinho Verde single variety Albariño, and I typed it into Google Maps. And where this physical winery was located in the very northern part of Portugal, it was actually within 1 kilometer of the border with Portugal. I mean, the winery must have overlooked more Portugal than it did Spain. So on the Spanish-Portuguese border, I mean. So the fact that the Portuguese example tasted so similar to the Spanish example, when I saw that, didn't entirely surprise me. Same variety, different name, but virtually the same place. Northwest Spain, northern Portugal. Yeah. Okay, so let's see what flavors and aromas you guys are getting. Let me just see here. Okay. Maria is saying savory and earthy. Yeah, I do think we'll talk about this more in a minute, but I do think one of the really cool aspects of Grüner Veltliner is that it's one of the most savory white grapes in Europe. I think that's a very interesting feature of the wine. Kathleen, lime, lemon, white pepper, white blossom. And Louise, honey melon, candy store. Wow, okay. Sugar pears, cardamom, good. Corey is noting the old adage, Albariño is salt and Grüner is pepper. Okay, good. Interesting note there from Corey. I think that can be helpful to many people. Maria, lentils. Good. I know exactly what you mean. I think the lentils note from Maria is also consistent with the savory notes that you were mentioning earlier, Maria. The lentils is a kind of specification of what kind of savory it is. Think about lentils, by the way. I know exactly what you mean by the lentils in Grüner Veltliner, but if you ever want to experience a different kind of lentils, then Northern Rhone Syrah, in a different world. You pull the cork and sometimes those wines smell exactly like dried lentils out of the package. So weird, such a weird note, but I find that consistently, especially like the orange ones, the orange lentils. I think that's partly reduction. I think Syrah is quite a reductive variety, and I think the lentils are part of that. I think Grüner is quite a reductive variety as well. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked, but lentils, you just got me thinking. Okay, Alice is saying her creme style is very muted in comparison to the other wines today. Pithy, lemon, peppery, and earthy. So again, maybe we're on the spectrum of perhaps the savoriness or the earthiness reducing how aromatically expressive the wine is compared to the two previous. Dusty, savory, says Stanislavs. Rumor is saying lime, green apple, and spicy notes from Camp Tal. Good. No, these are all excellent notes. Sounds like you've got very, very good examples. Okay, so let's think about the acid structure components here. So what level of acidity are we going to go with? Here we've had two wines, a high acidity, or maybe the Riesling was very high, depending on where exactly yours came from, but very high for Albariño, of course. Where are we going to land with Grüner Veltliner? Kathleen saying high, but not as high as the previous one. Lynn is saying, I find it hard to tell Pinot Grigio, Albariño, and Grüner apart in blind tastings. They all have a white peppery quality and some bitterness on the finish. Well, Lynn, you just hit the nail on the head. There's a reason why in these webinars and whenever anyone asks me to do a presentation about acid structure in white wines, I always put Albariño and Grüner Veltliner together. I always put them next to each other because people traditionally in blind tastings always confuse the two varieties. And my argument is, in fact, they're quite different, but we just need to know what to look for. But this is an example where I think focusing on the acid structure can be very helpful. So let's see what we find in just a sec. Corey is high, Fred is high, Louise saying high and quite integrated into the fruit compared to the previous two. Okay, good. Luciana high, Stanislav's likewise. Now, what are you getting for the type of acidity? What's the right word to describe the sensation that that acidity gives when it hits your palate? Stanislav is saying tingly. I like tingly, that's good. And Fred is saying bracing and clean, very clean, crystal clear. Okay, good, interesting. Kathleen is going with zesty. Nisha is saying prickly and tangy. Nisha is also commenting that yes, the acidity is certainly high, but it's well integrated. Louise likes tingly as well. Good. Tingly, again, I tried to describe this the other week. Very, very hard to describe tingly if you're not a native English speaker, but tingly kind of like, it's almost like a little prick inside your mouth, just pricking the inside of your mouth. That's like tingly, a tingly sensation. Or maybe a little bit, you know, like when the hairs on your arms stand up. That's like a little bit of a tingly sensation, perhaps. Maybe I'm stretching it here. Mouth-watering and juicy acidity, says Alice. Luciana says bracing. Ruma says tangy. Nisha thinks that tingly is more powerful than prickly. Yeah, I think that's probably right. So prickly, add one more step of intensity up from prickly, and you get tingly. Okay, good. And then finally, the shape of the acidity. When you perceive the intensity of the acidity, do you feel it's especially in one place, or is it consistent like Chardonnay, linear, more vertical like Riesling, staking down the wine, or peaks and troughs? You guys tell me what you find. It's definitely one of the more funky ones of mine, but I think quite a fun one to taste when you understand what to look for. But I just want to see what you guys come up with first. Luciano is saying in Portuguese, tingly would be pipoca. I think pipoca is a nicer sounding word than tingly. I love that. Thank you, Luciano. And Maria is saying it's like it comes and goes, the acidity, with ups and downs, peaks and troughs. So this may be more of a peaks and troughs wine than either we've had so far tonight. Very good, thank you, Luciana. Fred is saying it's a bit like the Chenin with a kind of crescendo. And Kathleen is saying she feels it at the front of the mouth, and then it feels a bit like a roller coaster of acidity. Okay. Ruma, it sounds like you're finding something similar. The acidity is felt like in waves with a dip in the middle, and then it rises again on the finish, says Ruma. Good. Alice comments the acidity focuses itself towards the end and on the center of the tongue. Okay, good. Stanislav's noticing, along with a couple of other people here, that the acidity does seem to drop in the middle. Good. Okay, good. I think those are excellent comments. Again, I believe this is an acid structure full of character, of personality. I think especially the type of the acidity, the shape of the acidity are both very, very interesting in Grüner. So let's see what I came up with here. Here we go. So this So the level of acidity is high. As an aside, I was just thinking that most of the varieties we've had during these 3 sessions on white wines have shown high acidity. Maybe not Chardonnay, maybe not the Italian variety, maybe not Pinot Gris, but it's interesting that these very famous international world-class complex quality varieties often seem to have quite a high acidity. And just an interesting observation. The type of acidity, yeah, I think it's actually a bit stronger, than tingly. So I agree with the tangy people. A tang is more of a strong reverberation in the mouth than tingly. Tangy means almost like the acidity seems to bounce around inside your mouth. It's got so much life. Tangy, yeah, it's quite a strong one. Tangy, I think. Buzzing again, try and capture this sense of energy, but more than just kind of humming, but a real kind of buzz, like a buzzsaw, like a real sense of life. Buzzing, humming, maybe in lesser examples, maybe if you've got a more generic one. But from the more premium regions, I think tangy and buzzing are good. And then this is my famous, of course, roller coaster variety. They're probably, along with Chenin Blanc, more people have commented to me about this shape than any other in the book, I think. But my argument here is that, a little bit like the illustration below that of this kind of sine curve shape, what happens when you first put the wine in your mouth, just for a tiny second, it doesn't feel like there's that much acidity. But then it goes up, and then you're like, oh, there's the acidity. Okay, good. But then just as soon as you think that, it goes back down again, down the other side, and it almost seems to drop off completely. And just when you're wondering about where it's gone, then it comes back up on the finish, and it's actually higher than ever on the finish. So on the finish, it can look a bit like Chenin Blanc, with the crescendo, really think the acidity being most strongly felt on the finish. The difference is that here you also get it at the beginning, before you get that drop off. Louise is saying in the book you call the Grüner acidity quite low in the beginning. Well, I can't remember exactly what words I used, but the point I'm trying to demonstrate, especially with the second illustration at the bottom, is that it may start initially feeling a little soft, but then it rises very quickly and very suddenly, only to drop off again. So you can experience either, I guess, one of two things. In some examples, the acidity just starts high and then drops off. In others, it starts a little softer and then goes immediately high. I've experienced both, but the point is, it is up and then down and then up again as a kind of overall shape. Nisha likes buzzing. Very good. Luciana is commenting that she understands the sine curve. I'm not a mathematician, but for some reason, when I was writing the book, I had this idea in my head of the sine curve might be the right thing. So I Googled it. I saw an image of what a sine curve was. I was like, yes, that's the perfect thing. So that's what I put in the book. Good for people who like maths. Corey is saying that the Grüner acidity is if Chardonnay is consistent, very level and steady and reliable. Grüner is inconsistent because it has peaks and troughs. Good. Yes. So then I really want to get to the point that I know you're all desperate to hear me talk about, which is, isn't this acid structure just the same as Albariño? Because Albariño has the wall of acidity at the end and the wall of acidity at the beginning, and it seems to drop off in the middle. Why shouldn't Grüner Veltliner be so easily confused with Albariño? Well, for a number of reasons, I think. First of all, before we get onto the shape of it, let's just think about the type of acidity. I don't think the Grüner has got that very powerfully structured acidity that Albariño has, and maybe what I'm calling acidity in the Albariño is really phenolics, and that's okay. But I don't think Grüner is half as phenolic a variety, usually, as Albariño is. It can be, but not usually. So I think it might lack that very powerful superstructure, a combination of acidity and phenolics. The second thing is I think that lime pith acid sensation of Albariño, that kind of zestiness, to me, the acidity kind of rings, like imagine you ringing a bell. That's the kind of resonance of the acidity in Grüner Veltliner. I find the type of acidity to be very different. This tangy or buzzing acidity is quite different from the powerful but otherwise quite solid, firm acidity in the Albariño. I think they've got just different types of acidity. I think that's a huge thing. And then I think in terms of the shape, the big difference is that while in both varieties you feel it at the beginning and end, in the Grüner you feel it dropping off, whereas I think, and feel it coming back up towards the finish. Whereas I think in Albariño, there's quite a big gap just in the middle. What Fred was talking about, perhaps if you get the floor and the ceiling in Albariño to complete the four sides of the square in Albariño, then that adds to the sense of these kind of the walls, the solid structure of Albariño compared to the movement that you feel all the way through in Grüner. So I think that's quite a big difference as well. But I do understand the contrast. And if you find the shape thing difficult, then I would just urge you to concentrate instead on the type of the acidity. The acidity has just got a different quality or texture, and without that massive heft of phenolic content that you get in the Albariño. Okay, so let's see what you guys are saying. Yeah, Corey is just commenting that it doesn't have to be just one curve. It can be up and down and up and down. Again, I think what I find super cool though about the acid structure of Grüner is just the sense of energy in there. You know, that the roller coaster image it kind of captures, that it's a whole journey with its peaks and troughs, more than any other variety I know. It's such a weird sensation. Naturally, I think we all go into this thinking that things should behave like Chardonnay behaves or like Riesling behaves, where the acidity is pretty predictable. It's here, it's consistent, it's reliable, we understand it, we know what it's going to do. But Grüner Veltliner is the counter argument to that. It's up and down and up again. I think it's cool. So I think it's got a sense of, to try and use that language of Riesling again, I think it's got a sense of movement, like more like Chardonnay compared to the stasis, the sense of being in one place that Albariño has. To me, Albariño doesn't have so much dynamic movement of acidity in the mouth as Grüner does. It's a bit more static, like Riesling is, albeit with a very different structure. Okay, any more questions about Riesling? Excuse me, about Grüner Veltliner. So Grüner certainly is a complicated structure. I mean, there's a reason I left these three varieties today to the final session of this webinar series, because these are the ones where you have to have had a bit of experience of perhaps more straightforward acid structures in order to understand what's going on here. But I also think that in a way they're the most intriguing. They're the most dynamic. They've got a lot going on here, a lot to think about. I find them fun. I find them an intellectual challenge to try and figure out. Okay. So let me just go forward to our final slide. Okay, so here's the point I was just making, that while they're often confused, they have different types of acidity. The acidity has got a different feeling in the mouth between those two varieties, and then a slightly different shape. Just look out in Grüner Veltliner for the downward slope, feeling that acidity drop off. Making the contrast in order to understand what I mean by Riesling having a vertical structure with that kind of backbone of steely acidity. Compare it to Chardonnay, which is always on a journey somewhere, going somewhere. Riesling, the point of Riesling acidity is to keep things in one place. The point of Chardonnay acidity is to push everything towards the finish. And then I'm just making a simple kind of summing up comment after we've tasted, what, 9 varieties now of different acid structures, 9 different varieties. So yeah, in addition to freshness, the sense of architecture, which we've talked about today, especially with regard to Albariño, of purpose, of direction, of energy. So we often think about, I think it's kind of, we often think about acidity as being that element of the wine which refreshes the palate as a balance to the fruit, which can be soft and ripe and may need that balance of acidity. But my point here, when you do this deep dive into acid structure, is then you begin to realize what other things that the acidity can offer to a wine as well. The sense of shape in the mouth, just like tannins do in red wine, so the wine doesn't collapse in on itself. And then the sense of energy or purpose or life given to the wine by the acidity. All of those things very subtly are crucial to understanding the very nature of what these varieties are and why they're great varieties and why they're interesting varieties. Lesser varieties have got weaker structures, less obvious purpose to the acidity, perhaps less well integrated acidity. All the varieties today have quite well integrated acidity, which is, I think, is a nice feature in the wines. Okay, any final questions? So Louise is saying, there are a million other white grape varieties. Isn't it easy to confuse them even on acid structure? Well, I guess the point of what I'm saying is that among the major varieties, like if you find me some obscure Croatian white variety, I don't know what the acid structure of that one is, but among the major international grape varieties, which are grown in different regions around the world, then they have very distinct acid structures, one from another. Riesling is very different from Chardonnay, is very different from Albariño. So perhaps there are others as well, but given the fact that most of us here are students, or we're very interested in studying wine, or we just really want to try and find out, go to the heart of the matter, it's extremely unlikely that you're ever going to be assessing very unusual varieties in as much detail as this. But these very famous varieties, which are grown all around the world, you can be very well and easily asked to discuss the acidity in the wine. And if you understand what that acidity is, then you're going to be in a much better position both to identify the variety if you're doing a blind tasting, but also just to really understand what different elements of the wine contribute, the acidity balancing the sugar and the fruit and the phenolics, all this kind of stuff. So I like to concentrate on these major varieties. Okay. Louise is saying that the Albariño is only in Spain and Grüner is only in Austria. That's true, but these are some of the great white grape varieties of the world for all the reasons that we just discussed. Fantastic definition, fantastic aromatics, flavor dimension. And so for that reason, they're worth studying. If you're an art student, you're going to study Picasso and Renoir. We're wine students, so we study the best because that's how we know what's possible in the world of white wine. And these varieties that we discussed during this webinar course certainly fit that category. Okay, so we have done white wines. Congratulations, everyone. We are finished with acid structure. And next week, we will move to what I think is actually easier, which is tannin structure in red wines. So if you found the acid structure quite an abstract concept, you're not the only one, don't worry. But I think tannin structure is much more easy to understand. And so that's what we'll be moving on to next week. Thank you, guys, and I will see you same time next week.